Ora pawb. Good morning, everybody. It falls to me to, I'll use the keys, that's easy. It falls to me to deliver the last paper of the weekend, and it's been a real pleasure to be here, and such a pleasure to work with Heather and the trustees and our chair on the booklet as well on this anniversary of the association. I'm going to talk to you this morning just about changing ways that new technology is helping us to record Welsh heritage from the air. I'm going to be looking firstly at aerial photography and how the advent of digital photography has actually been really useful for us after all the worries and concerns in the early 2000s about the loss of quality of negatives, how we're using drones as well to record coastal heritage in Ireland and Wales, and how we're using airborne laser scanning as well, which is the sort of upper end of the technology to still, record the archaeological landscapes, and we still need the brain in the process as well. The technology gives us an underlay, but then we need to do the survey work on top of that. There are many ways to get into the air nowadays. If you have enough money, you can have a big military drone. This is the Abbey drone coming to land over West Wales. I use an aeroplane most of the time, a Cessna 172. People still do kite photography, as with the very first photograph of Stonehenge taken by the Royal Observer Corps in 1906. This summer, I was lucky enough to get into a helicopter in Cardiff, because it's the only way we can get airborne legally in North Wales without getting the plane up from Haverfordwest. I'll talk later about airborne laser scanning, which is a big, very expensive way to map the landscape, used a lot for city and town planning and floodplain planning. We've got a little drone here as well. But if you can't get a helicopter or an aeroplane on your budget, you can use Google Earth nowadays to scour photographs for archaeology, which a lot of people do. And if you have a couple of pounds in your back pocket, you can still get a photo pole, which we still use. This is me at Abersoch back in March, which is a really good way to record archaeology if it's too windy for a drone. And in the project I'm working on with several colleagues, the Cherish Coastal Heritage and Climate Change project running in Ireland and Wales. It's a European funded project. We're using what we call a toolkit approach to survey the whole coast edge of Wales and Ireland, or our baseline study sites. I'll be talking today about airborne laser scanning from a big survey aircraft, how we use drones as well to do photogrammetry, and me in the aeroplane. I still have a role buzzing around in the aeroplane, but we're doing everything else as well. This summer's been very busy with dives on historic wrecks, marine scanning, community excavations, peat coring as well. So it's another talk for another time, the Cherish work. But what we do in the air, fits into a whole way of understanding heritage in Wales, and particularly along the coast. The beginnings of aerial photography were back in 1906 with those first air photographs of Stonehenge that were taken. But all the technological developments came with the First World War, as one would expect. And immediately after the First World War, pilots who found they quite enjoyed what they'd been doing, like Claude here in Aerial Films, with his colleague Francis Wills, who was an architect who worked as an observer during the First World War, formed Aerial Films, one of the earliest companies, or the first company to do air photography in Britain, which has provided us with some of the very earliest views of Wales. And here they are in their Airco bomber, DH9 bomber, with these massive glass plate cameras. And we touched upon this, particularly in Heather's talk as well yesterday, about the equipment these people had with them to do the job that I do nowadays with such easier technology, really. The Aerofilms archive has delivered us some incredible views, like Cardiff in 1937 here, Cardiff Castle, Howell's advert on the high street there. But this is a view that I couldn't take nowadays, because this is about 300 or 400 feet above the rooftops in a military biplane. And one has to imagine the noise echoing around the streets of this biplane roaring over the rooftops in 1937, quite a sight for people shopping. And in above Brecknock, which a book we did with Chris Musson, there's views of Hay on Wye from the same year. And you can see people stepping out of their shop doorways to see the Aerofilms bomber coming over the top. Quite remarkable early views, an incredible legacy. And there are other pioneering aerial photographers, O.G.S. Crawford, of course, who worked with Alexander Keeler, and Major Allen, whose photograph we tracked down the Ashmolean for the new anniversary booklet of Sudbrook Promontory Fort, excavated by Victor Earl Nash Williams in the late 30s. And you can see golfing tees within it, a tennis court, this great coastal promontory fort, and then the great pumping station for the Severn Tunnel, which still stands here and still works every day. And Nash Williams thanked Major Allen for his June 1938 view, which actually has a military camp at the top as well, you can see. And in Nash Williams's article, thanking Major Allen for the air photograph, generously furnishing the Admiral air photo of the site, but also to Murray Threepland, who's obviously not quite so adept in the air, for a second view of great interest, but taken under difficulties with the hand camera, which is at a sort of steep angle over the site, which shows that there is a skill to doing air photography. And Murray obviously went on, I don't know what he went on to do. But the aerial photography is quite an intense process. It's all very well looking at the air photographs, but here's me in the back of the plane over Ramsey Island a couple of years ago with my colleague Dan, with 120-mile-an-hour wind in my face, orbiting around, looking at the archaeological landscape below the plane and taking photographs. And those perfectly still, sharp, in-focus photographs are what you see as a result of this survey process. So the aeroplane still performs a valuable role. In 2018, we had a record drought in Wales, where crop marks were showing everywhere for about 2.5 or 3 weeks. And in those conditions, a drone won't do it. You have to get airborne Haverfordwest. Here we are on the 10th of July, all the way up to North Wales, with lunch at Carnarvon Airport, and then all the way down the Theme Peninsula and down again, 5 hours, 800 photographs, just to get the crop marks as they're showing. Or on the 19th of July here, out from Haverfordwest up to Prestatyn and Rhyl, down to Welshpool, and then down to Chepstow to mop up sites before rain was falling. So the wide-ranging power of the plane is still an essential part of the toolkit. And we've been able to export this idea of exploratory reconnaissance and air photography out to Ireland, where they've had a sort of hit and miss history of doing air photography. I was lucky enough in 2019 to do some air photography over Dublin Bay. This is Dublin, the great stadium here in the Howth Peninsula, and do some exploratory photography over Newgrange and the Hill of Tara, and even crop marks in the Boyne Valley, which are showing in late March, very early in the season. So for recording crop marks, recording monuments, air photography is very, very useful still. And of course, air photographs formed a major component of the recent World Heritage bid for the slate landscape of Northwest Wales. So flying in May and June with beautiful sunshine, rich colours in the vegetation, up high, 2,500, 3,000 feet, to record these landscapes and sell their outstanding universal value to the world. So we discover monuments when we have drought conditions. We record known monuments that we know about, like Elysic's Pillar here that we saw yesterday on its barrow, but also in 2018, in July, 10th of July, another barrow, a Bronze Age barrow showing as a crop mark just here. It wasn't discovered on this flight. The Cleopas Trust had recorded it a few years ago, but it's all about timing with getting into the air. We return on the 19th of July, a little bit small to see, but the farmer's cropping the field there. He's cutting all the wheat there, all the barley, and so the crop mark has disappeared. So when we're doing air reconnaissance, we have to be in the air at the right time of day, the right time of week to record these marks while they're showing before they disappear. And on the same flight on the 10th of July over Vala Crucis as well, the Abbey, picking up square parch marks in the pasture alongside, which may be remains of the Abbey precinct, or maybe water pipes and other service structures as well. But so important when we have these record drought conditions to bank lots and lots of photographs of the surrounding pasture in case I've missed something. At Abbeycombe here, of course, in the same year, we did get medieval graves, a medieval cemetery alongside the Abbey, which is a real bonus, published in ArchCam this year with Nigel Jones. But new technology is really helping us. There was such worry when digital photographs came out that they wouldn't be of the same quality as traditional film. but we can do so much with digital photographs. This is a rather unpromising photograph I took in Pembrokeshire in the 2018 drought, showing three huge barrows, very, very faint, of a round barrow cemetery on the northern flanks of the Preseli Hills at Crosswell. And when we landed after taking this, I told Mike Parker Pearson we've got a new barrow cemetery in his study area, which he was delighted about. But only a couple of months later, in October of the year, we can split apart the color bands of this photograph in Adobe Photoshop, push the red color band, and it actually reveals so much more archaeology in the picture. Suddenly, an additional barrow in the alignment here and fragments of another one up here as well. And it's remarkable to think that's exactly the same photograph. That's what I see out of the aeroplane window. And that's what the computer can give us out of that picture as well. An inner ring here as well. 40 to 50 meter wide barrow disc barrows here, as big as dry barrows down near Pembroke Dock, one of the big barrow cemeteries in West Wales now. And this technique helps us to reevaluate what people have been seeing for years. Here we are in a field west of Caerwent at 5 Lanes Roman Villa. There's the Roman Villa here, a scheduled ancient monument. 5 Lanes was discovered, the villa was discovered in the 19th century. It's been overflown for 50 years by Cambridge University and various other flyers as well. But this is late June in South Wales. And we have this huge enclosure complex behind it, fields and enclosures around it. I was very keen to make a map of those from these crop marks to better understand how the fields relate to the villa. And in rebalancing the image again in October of the same year of another photograph of 5 Lanes Villa, we had a surprise. I saw half circles appearing here and here, which I thought maybe ploughed out barrows, but actually they are claviculi gateways of a Roman marching camp. Here, picked out, only the third to be discovered in Monmouthshire. Monmouthshire, of course, the area where the Silures had a 30-year battle with the Romans. So crucial evidence of a Roman marching camp, and less than a mile from Caerwent Roman town, this military camp. And it's the first Roman camp in Wales to have outturned claviculi gateways as well. So it's been hiding there in all the photographs, but we need the digital photographs to really help us bring it out. And air photography, being in a plane, we can stretch what we do nowadays with a camera. Sue mentioned photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is an old technique used in the First and Second World Wars, or Second World War particularly. Multiple overlapping photographs taken by reconnaissance pilots used to put together 3-dimensional models. In the Second World War, they create whole 3D models of foreign ports and docks for bombing regimes. And of course, the Ordnance Survey used photogrammetry during the 20th century. But now, if I orbit a site and take hundreds of photographs from the aeroplane, like we would do in a drone, we can pop those together in a 3D model. And we're using those now to record monuments that won't be standing in a couple of years' time. Mulshire Hall, we did that for, and the 20th century Wrexham police station here. This is quite a basic model, just a quick generated model that I flew over in 2019, demolished in 2020 to make way for new development. So we can see Wrexham police station as it stood there, even though it doesn't exist anymore. So techniques we're using with drones, we can also replicate in the cockpit of the aircraft as well. Now, coming to drones, or UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, as we like to refer to them technically, these are an incredibly practical tool now to give us more of a toolkit. Here I am on the top of Mulshire Hall with Sue, recording this in 2019. We did the photogrammetry from the Cessna and then just used the drone to infill video and photography because it's such a complex site surrounded by busy roads. It's a bit too dangerous to fly a drone around beyond the scope of the building there as well. So all permissions in place, operating off the roof of the building. Our drones come in all shapes and sizes now. This is the one we use for our European project, our coastal project, our little Phantom, because it fits in a backpack. We can put it in our backpack and hike for a mile to our survey site. If you're doing a whole bit of coastline, you can use a fixed wing drone, like a little glider with a launching ramp sometimes, and they get these big beasts. This is a Matrice, about 10,000 pounds, which will hold a digital camera underneath it. And this is what you use for filming, for country file, that sort of thing as well. But you need a car to move this around. It comes in a case the size of one of these tables. It's absolutely enormous. So people bought these and found they're unable to fly them, because once they're flying, they're incredibly dangerous things as well. So we're happy with our little small one that we put in the backpack. And how do drones and aeroplanes shape up? People think now we have a drone, we don't need to fly. But as I've been saying, the aeroplane will give us up to 5,000 feet of reconnaissance height. We can fly up to 130 miles an hour on visual flight rules during the day, avoiding clouds. And we can do this for regional or countrywide survey. The drone is an incredibly useful tool, but we can only go up to 400 feet to stay out of civil aviation, so we don't crash into aeroplanes. And we have to fly within a visual line of sight of 500 meters, half a kilometer. So perfect for surveying this hotel or doing Valacruce's Abbey if we were there. And we told all the landowners and so on, we had the insurance in place. So two different tools for two different ways of seeing the landscape. But drone imagery, as we're aware now, on television and film is such an incredible way to see the landscape. This is Grasshome Island, and we're out there 2 autumns ago, October 2019, excavating on Grasshome, 7 miles off the Pembrokeshire coast. It's a very difficult island to get out to sea and to land on. So this just takes you out to Grasshome. Here we are excavating one of the small buildings. Douglas Haig and Dylan Roberts were out here for nearly a week in the 70s, living quite rough conditions, I think. And there I am on my photo pole as well, that I talked about earlier on. There's the photo pole. St. David's Head in the distance, and this lunar landscape of gannet nests, which is steadily coming across Grasshome Island and covering the archaeology. So drone videos are just an incredible way to see the landscape. There are many rules about how you fly drones, and being trained to fly a drone it's quite a laborious process. We all hate being buzzed by a drone when we're on a footpath or in a castle particularly. I got my drone qualification about 3 years ago. I had to learn about meteorology, aircraft safety, operating, legal operating rules and so on as well. And there are drone codes so that you don't fly too close to airports and you stay out of the way of civil aviation as well. But after Gatwick, the Civil Aviation Authority tightened up its drone regulation, but made it so complicated now that it's very difficult to follow actually what anybody needs to do. And there's a heritage drone users group that meets to discuss how to stop drones flying over castles or international trust properties. And it's very difficult nowadays. It's a legal minefield. So when we fly our drone, we make sure we do everything correctly and properly. If we're going out to do a survey, this is Nab Head back in 2019 in Pembrokeshire, where Andrew David and Ken Murphy and the David Trust did all their work on the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer site. First of all, we have to find out who owns the site. Is it the national park or a neighbouring landowner? We have to do a whole pre-flight survey, even noting where the nearest accident of emergency is, get our risk assessment in place, liability insurance, then check with Natural Resources Wales about the chough nesting windows as well, so we don't disturb nesting birds. And when we've got all that clear and put our warning signs out on the footpath, we can actually then fly the drone. Because if it lands and hits somebody, then it all gets very serious. So it's a lot of paperwork to get these drone surveys done. But when it all comes together, it's a brilliant tool. And we principally use the drone, well, it's useful for video and photography. We principally use it for photogrammetric mapping. And in the European project that we're working on, it's all about how quickly our coastal heritage is eroding into the sea, how our promontory forts are collapsing, how fast are they losing sections of cliff, and actually the data, the record of these coast edge places is very, very poor. The surveys are often 1960s or 1970s Ordnance Survey, and so we need a really good, accurate model of where these things are to the nearest few centimeters if we can. Then we'll archive that, and in 50 or 100 years' time, you can come back and get that model out and find out how much of the cliff has been lost. So for sites like Dinas Dinlley Coastal Fort in North Wales, we're using drones and laser scanning to map exactly where it is. Now, Dinas Dinlley, we had a hugely successful excavation. Gwynedd Archaeological Trust ran that this year with the National Trust and Cardiff funding as well. The Cherish project contributing to, and a second year of digging on this site, which has revealed an incredible Iron Age roundhouse, or Iron Age Romano-British roundhouse, about 12 or 13 meters diameter, most of the size of this room. Actually, we dropped it into this room, Andrew, and that's about 10 meters from the edge of the cliff. It's going soon. But Dinas Dinsley is a complex site to fly a drone. We have an airport just up the way here. So when we fly a drone, we have to tell the airport and they have to reroute their emergency traffic around the drone. So it's not a good place to pop up a drone if you haven't checked with everybody first. What we do, we'll survey and control points on the ground before we fly. Those will be seen in the photographs the drone takes, and then we can build these wonderfully detailed models, digital models of the cliff top. So these views of the cliff are not photographs. They exist just in the computer, and they're accurate to a couple of centimeters, the length of your thumb, really. And we can do those every year and then compare one with the other, and the computer will tell us what bits have dropped off. We've had some major collapses, actually. But a computer is good for some things, but not as good as printing out a big model, a big plastic model of the same thing derived from this drone footage. And this is a tabletop model that then we can take into schools, and the school children can look at Dinas Dinsley on the tabletop and see where all the lumps and bumps are, where the ramparts of this Iron Age fort are, and look at the dunes on the beach and everything as well. It's a really amazing amount of detail. So once we have this data, this photogrammetry, we can do more with it. And we've been getting more ambitious. In 2020, last August, we went to Castle Martin, that amazing peninsula there with Flintstone Bay Promontory Fort, the Green Bridge of Wales and Legig Stacks, and did some drone surveys for a couple of days there. And this one from Croxley Down Promontory Fort to Flintstone, just to map this eroding Carboniferous limestone cliff. Flintstone's been losing a lot of big sections of cliff, a major cliff fall here in 2018 or 2008. This is a huge Iron Age fort with these big ramparts here as well, and roundhouses within the interior, and a 19th century quarry, an offloading place at the tip of it as well. And you see we're getting every rock and pebble on the beach being mapped as well. But again, this is just so we can map the change happening. And the drone's very clever. This is about a mile of coastline. It will pop up, work for 20 minutes, and then start beeping and land again. You pop a new battery in, press a button, it'll take off again and start from where it left off. So it's a very clever little machine. And you have to stand there making sure it doesn't crash into any cows. But we get this incredible model, incredible data. There's Kyrie Promontory Fort near St. David's. We did some excavations on this summer in September. But the lump of data doesn't tell you anything more about the archaeology of the hill fort. It tells you which bits of cliff are falling off, but we still go back, and it's not showing very well, but do an interpretive topographic survey. My colleagues Louise and Dan will still go out and map the fort and discuss it and work out which Iron Age ramparts were built first, which were built second, and draw up a phased plan. So that gives us the cliff edge erosion, and this gives us an understanding of how the Iron Age Promontory Fort was built and developed as well. So it's a process of, using the best of our new technology, but then doing more with it as well. And I come finally to LiDAR, light detection and ranging, just like radar. This is a comparatively new technique developed for military applications in the 1980s and 1990s, first used by archaeologists in the late 1990s. And now it's a reasonably affordable technique to commission this method of sort of flying for parts of your landscape if you're interested in studying them in more detail. And I understand Pembrokeshire County Council, or National Park in Pembrokeshire, has just commissioned a lot of new LiDAR. And here we can see a wonderful 3D view of Ramsey Island, flown in 2017 by a very large survey aircraft, costing a few £1,000s. Why are we flying this data? How is it useful to us? So light detection and ranging, one of the key benefits of this, firstly, it gives you a very, very accurate model of anything that flies over: buildings, trees, cows, people in the street. Everything's frozen in time as a very, very accurate three-dimensional model. But also, as the laser falls through trees, a bit like snow falling through woodland, a laser will hit the floor, the woodland floor under the trees, and you can take away everything else except the woodland floor. And this is Kyrie Hill Fort in Cardiff, currently being studied by Cardiff University, surrounded by houses, heavily wooded ramparts, and with a click of a button, very literally, you can take away all the woodland, all the houses, and reveal the Iron Age ramparts of this great triangular hill fort in Ely in Cardiff, in a way that it hadn't ever been seen before. This was done about 7 or 8 years ago. and you're using a very expensive aircraft that knows where it is in the air. You have a ground base station, and as the aircraft bumps and wobbles through the air, is hit by air pockets, and the scanning lasers working underneath it, you've got several different computers working out how to remove all those errors from the data and give you a flat, finished model of the landscape, hence the expense in commissioning this data. We first put our foot in the water with Skomer Island in 2011, and we commissioned the Environment Agency to do new airborne laser scanning of Skomer and Skocum Island in the Marloes Peninsula. And thankfully in 2011, we'd had a very hard winter, so it flattened all the bracken and vegetation. They had snow on Skomer Island, and it was a half-meter resolution, so about the length of this circular table, probably. That's each point, so that's your accuracy, really. And it gave us a wonderful new model of Skomer Island, a three-dimensional computer model. You can put the sun in any direction, so you can highlight those lumps and bumps, those earthworks that Grimes and John Evans studied. We made a new map of the field boundaries. We then could take that out in the field and examine each field boundary and start to classify them. And then we could talk to the Wildlife Trust staff with the LiDAR printed out. And it's been an incredibly useful tool, and we've put it on exhibition in the visitor centre there as well. So a very, very useful tool if you know what you need to do with it. And when we had our European project, the Cherish project, looking at climate change and coastal heritage in 2017, the first thing we did is commission new airborne laser scanning of the 6 Welsh islands: Puffin, the Tidwalls, the Skerries off Anglesey, Bardsey, Entley, Ramsey as well, and Grasshome Island, because none of these had really good high-resolution 3D data, and there was no way to chart erosion. Coming to Entley, Bardsey Island, this is the slipway that you land at, where Colin the boatman pulls his boat up, and there's the eroding Hesseltine Isthmus, where the road built in the 50s is falling into the sea, and this is a really good place to study coastal erosion at its speed, because you have archaeology falling out of the section here. Mesolithic blades, early medieval bone and fireplace remnants as well, that we've radiocarbon dated. So lots of archaeology coming out of the isthmus here. So we had Bardsey Island flown in 2017, which gave us a whole new 3D model of the island. And we just zoomed in on part of that here. There's the boat ramp and the boat shed. There's some of Colin's boats sitting around here. And look, every rock, every pebble mapped to the size of this, actually 25 centimeters is about that level. So almost the length of your hand. There's the accuracy here now. And we can see bits of the seawall falling into the sea, the sand mapped on the beach. And actually, some of you may be able to see tiny dots in the fields. These are the sheep on Bardsey Island. So individual sheep have been mapped. So we can archive this now for the next 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. This is what Bardsey looked like in 2017. And we then used our eyes, used our hand to map every field boundary on the island, the medieval ridge and furrow, and all the other earthworks on Bardsey now mapped. This falls into what Jane Kenny's been doing over the years with the Gwynedd Trust of the management plan, and give better information back to that process as well. So it's an incredibly useful tool for mapping these islands. Ramsey Island, where Heather and Terry as well have done so much work over the years. This is Ramsey Island here, just off Pembrokeshire. There's St David's Head and St Patrick's Chapel about there. Sort of heavily farmed in the middle part of the 20th century, in the 50s and so on, brought to the early 90s, I think, by the RSPB. And Heather and Terry did the first archaeological survey, and there's more ongoing now as well. But Ramsey had no new three-dimensional data. It just had Ordnance Survey mapping. No way to really accurately map every field boundary, every lump and bump, and some of the coastal erosion which is happening midway down the island. So this is the new airborne laser scanning map of Ramsey Island. And this model on the left here is lit with 16 different light angles. So it pops every little earthwork up. We have the air photo mapping, or the mapping from the LiDAR. And Ramsey's been fairly heavily blitzed in the central part, with a lot of sod busting going on as well. There are records of chapels, or at least one chapel in the area of the farm near the landing slip, and kist burials eroding from the above the landing area there. Andrew Davis collects a lot of prehistoric flint, but it's on Carnslindine and Carniskibor as well. We have these potential prehistoric field boundaries, a bit like Skomer, but very, very different archaeology. But the magic of this data for non-archaeologists, for the wardens of the island, this yellow fuzz over the island, that's actually all the bracken and vegetation. You can actually separate that out in the LiDAR. So I can tell them where all the vegetation on the island is, which is useful for their data on nesting birds, the RSPB. So we can map a lot more detail of Ramsey and also get into the bits of the landscape. This is Carnllyndain on Ramsey Island, and using a different technique to look at this laser data, it can sort of shreds the surface of the model. So you can see every lump and bump, every bracken, every bit of bracken, every footpath, every rock, and we can start to map these surviving prehistoric boundaries. There are a few cairns on here as well. I'm not sure if there's anything worth scheduling here, but it's a sort of fragments of a prehistoric farming landscape, and of course a medieval landscape on Ramsey as well, and some unusual features too. But again, we can take this into the field. We can discuss the data with the wardens as well, and show them where all their archaeology is, and give them a copy of it as well, because it's free, it's European funding. So there's lots of things we can do with that. And where it all starts to come together a bit is an island like Puffin Island on this serial, where we've been doing quite a lot of work over the last couple of years, and put together a big report last year. There's a bit of finishing off to do on it as well before we launch it publicly. But Puffin Island is a very interesting island. It's one of our baseline study sites for the European project, for the Cherish project, basically to map how the vegetation is affecting the church and the monastery, and indeed how the church tower is faring as well. So Puffin, off the northeast part of Anglesey, it's a 12th century church and an earlier monastic settlement associated with Penmon on mainland Anglesey. It's like a whaleback rising out of the sea, really. The landing point here, you have to thrash your way up through the vegetation here onto the top of the island, and there's a telegraph station at the far end, which is quite well preserved. A lovely trustees board, a carved masonry panel outside it still, and the site of a flagstaff up here on the island somewhere as well. And there's the church tower, an important medieval sea mark in its time, too, standing out of this woodland. It's owned by Sir Richard Williams Bulkley, who very kindly allowed us to go out on 2 successive times to see the remains and to make a survey of it. It's now managed as a bird reserve with no landing permissible without the permission of the license holder, which is currently Liverpool University. Now, I've never been to the Galapagos Islands. I'm not sure if anybody in the room has. I often wonder what the Galapagos is like when I'm on Skomer at the Wick with all the birds circling around the cliffs. And Puffin Island is no different because it's entirely reserved for wildlife. And we went there in 2018 in June with Jeff Spencer from Cadw. It was a good opportunity to get Cadw out there as well. And we're dressed in all our rough gear so that we could push our way through blackthorn and bird mess as well. We were warned what to wear, really. So we're taken out there by boat, and all the cliffs on the northern cliffs are covered in birds, guillemots and gannets and so on as well. Absolute cacophony of birdsong. And then pushing away up in June with Jonathan Green, who's the license holder. He's there to look at the bird wildlife. You have nesting seagulls in the path as you walk through, which you have to skirt around, eggs in nests in the footpath as well, and waist-high vegetation. So you get disorientated very fast. But it's a wonderful place. And Longville Jones visited there in 1849, RCAHMW 1849. It's a spot that can still awaken feelings of admiration and wonder. And if it is no longer resorted to for the purposes of religion, it is often visited by those who love to see nature on a grand and unfettered scale. Of course, Longville Jones visited, Hereford Hops then in 1868, and then Howard Hughes visited and excavated in the later part of the 19th century. So quite an intense amount of interest in Puffin Island in the later 19th century. This is where LiDAR airborne laser scanning comes into its own. This is a 25 centimetre model of Puffin Island. The church is about here, and this is all the vegetation and bracken, all the bushes, the scrub trees that have grown up since the early 20th century. When the Royal Commission was here in 1929, it was open grazing, sheep grazing. But we can take all that away with the airborne laser scanning, strip it all away, and reveal the island under the woodland. The church and monastery, the monastic enclosure here, great field boundaries, some of which were mapped by the Royal Commission, a broad medieval ridge and furrow, which we hadn't picked up before, potential promontory enclosure, which may be prehistoric or early medieval, on the tip of the Island, and a field bank running down to the telegraph station here as well. Huge amount of new archaeology revealed that we've now done a detailed map of. And here you can see a comparison with woods. Here there's the church circle, the church tower, and there's the church tower. The monastic enclosure only just visible on the LiDAR, but impenetrable, impossible to get to on the ground today, invisible. Well, there's this great broad ridge and furrow on the island across the limestone plateau, and these great boundary on the sort of southeast side as well, running up towards the Flagstaff Point as well, and several boundaries mapped by the Royal Commission inventory, but we can add a bit more accuracy to that survey with this new data. We've done a lot on Puffin Island now. We even had the Geological Survey of Ireland come over to Anglesey a couple of years ago with a survey vessel to map with multi-beam, map the seabed around the island to give a better context to shipwrecks. There are some Henrichian shipwrecks off the island of some interest, and also see how the sediment is moving around it as well. And we've done laser scanning and drone survey as well. But we can see how the different perceptions of the past all come together. Now we're revisiting nearly 200 years later, from this early Cambrian visits, so nearly 160 years on as well. Longville Jones visited, published in 1849, his wonderful views of the 12th century Romanesque church tower. A little bit of an artistic license with the overlapping corbels at the top here, which I don't think ever were implemented really. You can see these former roof lines, the changes that we've seen at the church, and the former cottage. When Longville Jones visited, there was still a signalman and his family living on the island, the only inhabitants of the island in the cottage. What a life that must have been out there across the very difficult sound between Anglesey and Puffin Island. Harold Hughes, or Hereford Hops, visited in the 1860s and did sketch plans of the monastic enclosure, but schematics only, not really measured. But Harold Hughes, I've learned a bit more about him from this meeting, a Bangor architect, excavating with his colleagues in 1896, revealing the remains of a shrine here, presumably, well, potentially an earlier church alongside the later tower, burials in the shrine as well, burials just below the ground surface. And he used a rope to shin up the side of the church tower and make some great records of the windows. And then this is my colleague Dan's photogrammetric model from a drone, so flying the drone around the church tower, putting all those photographs into a computer and rendering out a new model of the church tower with all the moss and everything on it, down to about 2 centimeters, thumb accuracy, as it were. So if any bit drops off in the future, we at least know where it went and how the church tower has been affected. So different epochs of recording, different ways to record. Each one has its own value. But it's really like a lost world when you visit the church here. If anybody has a chance to go out, it's a rare treat to go out. It's like visiting a Greek island in the summer. Hereford Hops in 1868 said some foundations west of the church were too indistinct to be measured with any degree of accuracy, owing chiefly to the luxuriant growth of nettles. And you can see that very much here. We arrived with gardener shears and sticks to beat down the vegetation with triple SI consent, of course, from Natural Resources Wales. They knew we were going to do this. And here we are, just arriving with Jonathan Green and his students. First look in, there's the Roman box flue tile built into the 12th century church tower, showing reuse of Roman material. And there's these former roof lines on this side of the church, apparently where the former shrine stood. It could have been a shrine to a particular saint as well. So some important evidence out there. But that's as much as you'll see of the monastery behind you in this elder woodland. And I know the landowner, Sir Richard, was sort of disappointed that the vegetation's got so widespread on here. And they're looking at introducing goats and sheep and so on as well, if they can, onto the island. There's the church tower, Romanesque tower, as I said, a bit like being in Spain or Italy on a sunny day. And you have seagull chicks nesting on the walls, watching you survey, which is quite an unusual experience, which is why it's preserved as a nature reserve. But it's been a very special place to work. And we've been able to review the history of the island. And Janet Burton's done some more work recently on it as well, and pulled together a sort of news story of what there is. You can see the Royal Commission visited for their Anglesey inventory in 1929, published 1937. There's the church tower, in black. These are the potentially early medieval monastic enclosure. I wouldn't even presume to get into the early medieval period here. It's not my area. I'm surrounded by experts. But they didn't feel they needed to include any plans or surveys of the church because Harold Hughes had done it 20 years previously. But you'll never replicate this plan again without extensive vegetation clearance. But it's a pretty good survey. And there's our survey of the church using photogrammetry from a drone, just photography. And there's our survey using laser scanning, as Sue was showing with the building in Merthyr, the synagogue. That's what we've been able to do as well. So we get every stone, every bit of it mapped, giving that metrically accurate record for future management of the church. So that CADU and future stonemasons can see how this church looked in 2018 and so on. And there's just a sort of closing shot, really, a long view of the church tower from a drone. There's Dan down there with this woodland surrounding it here, the steep cliff edge down to the sea and looking off towards Penmaen Mawr and so on in the distance. So a remote, romantic place, but with digital technology and particularly that airborne laser scanning to strip away the woodland, we're able to give a bit more light back to Puffin Island. So as a rapid jaunt through how we've been bringing new technology into the air photography, seeing archaeology, which has always been there in the fields, but we haven't been able to visualize it properly until we've had computers to help us. Drones, which are an immensely valuable tool if used safely and properly to model our past, and airborne laser scanning, which if you've got the money to commission it and you have a reason to use it, it remains a really important tool in our arsenal as well. And here we are, 2019, coming back to land Dublin Airport after flying around Trim Castle and Newgrange and so on. So maybe one day I'll get back out there again to do that. So thank you all, and I hope that's been an interesting talk. Diolch.